Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to AGILE, the World Trade Center Institute's Innovation Series. We have an incredible panel discussion ahead on globalization and transition. All of us in this room and all of our guests online already know that it is globalization in transition and that globalization surely is not dead. I'm Kristen Lewis. I'm the Senior Director of Programs and Series for the World Trade Center Institute, and I'm honored to be your host today and share a stage with these incredible global leaders, who I will introduce shortly. But first, some important brief comments about WTCI and what makes powerful convenings like this possible. For over 30 years, WTCI has empowered globally minded leaders with ideas and connections to build a better world. Over 20 years ago, I began my career at WTCI as an intern and later as an employee. And here I've returned in 2022 to a nonprofit that marries the two things I am personally most passionate about: global business and social impact. At WTCI, we empower globally minded leaders from the Mid-Atlantic with ideas and connections to drive growth and global good. Whether developing leadership and exchange programs for hundreds of international visitors who come to Maryland via our International Visitor Leadership Program partnership with the U.S. State Department, or engaging with the leaders who drive Maryland's economic engines through our annual State of the Ports Address, our goal at WTCI is to support and develop current and future global and local leaders. Our youth fellowships programs prepare high school and college students, our workforce of tomorrow, for careers in global business. Our EDGE program, called the Bowie Fellowship, prepares mid and senior level executives to advance their leadership skills and careers in global business. Annually, we celebrate the best of our network through our Maryland International Business Leadership Awards. Also annually, we uplift and connect the powerful women in our network and the region through our annual Women Spanning the Globe conference. WTCI's work and programming is powered by our membership network, the largest network of globally minded businesses in the Mid-Atlantic. If you're interested in joining our network and supporting our programs and mission, I invite you to connect with Jeremy Rosendale, our Vice President of Membership and Business Development, after the session. Our members help make this work possible, and a warm welcome and thank you to the members that are here with us today. WTCI's programming focuses on 6 core themes that are top of mind for leaders in the global economy. AGILE is our dedicated, innovation-centric program series. Each year, we select a macro theme and we hold 4 sessions related to that theme. Our 2022 series theme is navigating the megatrends that impact global business. Today's Globalization and Transition session was originally going to be on cybersecurity. As all innovation-minded professionals know, pivoting quickly to meet rapidly changing market conditions is essential, and so we changed the topic. On behalf of WTCI's co-CEOs Susan Applin and Eddie Resende and our staff, we'd like to thank several people and companies who make our work in the AGILE series possible. Todd Rupert, chairman of WTCI's board of directors, is the visionary founder and sponsor of AGILE. His vision was to bring global leaders together to discuss and learn about breakthrough innovation and create an environment of collaboration for the leaders that are advancing the innovation economy in Maryland, the Mid-Atlantic, and around the world. Thank you, Todd, for your generous support and vision. Thank you to our platinum sponsor, RSM. RSM provides leading insights on the business, industry, and market conditions that affect the middle market to help drive confident business decisions and gain a competitive edge. RSM teams bring innovative ideas and tools to each client relationship along with their proven methodologies and technologies. And thank you to our gold sponsors, City BizList, our media partner, McIndoe Risk Advisory, MindGrub, Stanley Black & Decker, and a new sponsor, Tco, the Maryland Technology Development Corporation. Tco provides resources and connections that early stage technology and life sciences companies need to thrive in Maryland. Also, on behalf of our team and our co-CEOs, a very special thanks to WTCI board members that are here with us today. Thank you to Leslie Mancuso of Geopolitics, Alice Lau of Collins Aerospace, Clayton Millis of BD Integrated Diagnostic Solutions, Pete Stanford of Cushman and Wakefield, and Peter Bowie of the Bowie Stewart Foundation, founder of WTCI's EDGE Fellowship Program and our board vice chairman. I'd also like to thank Deborah Keelty, President Emeritus of WTCI, and my very first mentor out of college. Now to the main event. I could not be more excited by our dynamic panel of speakers today, 3 powerhouse leaders and experts in the dynamic and fast-paced world of global business. A welcome to Liz Hempel, partner at McKinsey & Company, Brooke Story, president of BD Integrated Diagnostic Solutions, and to Drew Greenblatt, president and owner of Marlin Steel Wire Products. Please join me in thanking our sponsors, special guests, and members, and also welcoming our speakers here with us today with a brief round of applause. Thank you. So it's good we've clapped. We can also take a deep breath and maybe stretch a little bit as we dive into a massive topic. So what does the media say about the state of globalization? As you've likely noticed, they have a lot to say about it, including a surge of articles in 2022 with very catchy headlines on the death or the demise of globalization. To be honest, WTCI even went with that attention-grabbing headline of, "Is globalization dead?" But you hear me saying intermittently, "Is globalization dead?" / globalization in transition. So we like to make fun of the media sometimes for these dramatic headlines, but that surge in reporting covering the state of globalization does match another very important surge. Here we see, in orange, the World Trade Volume Index, which hit a record high in 2022. Concurrently, stories with deglobalization as the central theme also hit a fever pitch. What I wish we could also see on this chart would be the current state of digital data flows and how they are trending. In the state of digital globalization, the chart mirrors the same dramatic upward trend. So, is globalization dead? It's not. And the rumors of deglobalization or the death of globalization are clearly premature, but we all know and we feel instinctively that a seismic shift is underway, a recalibration of global integration and rethinking of domestic and trade partnerships. I read another article yesterday in The Atlantic about how the climate economy is poised to explode, citing an overlooked Credit Suisse report on the Inflation Reduction Act. So this article was about the energy economy, not globalization, but it had a similar narrative that also applies here. How do we change the overall narrative from risk mitigation to one of opportunity capture? So here with us today, we have a panel of experts to help us decipher these market conditions. Articles tell us something as well. We have an expert from McKinsey & Company who's going to kick us off, and then we'll hear from 2 practitioners. So I'm going to invite Liz Hempel up next. Liz is a partner at McKinsey & Company, and she leads the firm's product development and procurement work for industrial clients. In her client work, she partners with engineering, supply chain, quality, and manufacturing organizations to bring advanced analytics and digital techniques to accelerate value while driving sustainable transformations. But right now, Liz is also acutely focused on advanced industries in globalization, how to optimize supply chains and manufacturing networks. She is McKinsey's lead on developing new insight for topics like supply chain regionalization, particularly across North America, which stem from macroeconomic factors reshaping global trade flows and this next era of globalization, and what local production might look like. Liz is going to set the stage with us with some macro conditions, and then we will pass it next to Brooke Story, and then we'll invite Liz back up at the end to close us out. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you. And thank you. So I'm Liz Hempel. I actually had an introduction for myself that was quite a bit more succinct, so thank you very much for the praise. But I lead McKinsey's industrial operations practice for North America. which essentially means I help our clients think about how they buy, make, and move product around the world, right? I have personally always found it a very interesting topic, but many more people are finding it a very, very interesting topic these days as we see how the world is changing and shifting. So just to set a little bit of the context today, frankly, most of these trends are probably well known to most of the folks that are here. Candidly, if you've opened a newspaper, you'll probably be seeing a lot of these trends. But just to level set a little bit of the context about why we're talking about deglobalization and really how we tend to frame it as a shift towards regionalization, particularly within supply chains, is a combination of factors that are happening in the broader macroeconomic environment trends, as well as what's happening within our own supply chains. So I think this is actually, did we get the new pages in? Or
this is it.
Okay. Apologies.
So this one and this one.
Okay. Sorry, I had a few updates right before this, but I think this is a slightly different version of this. But broader context of this is, we know inflation is up, right? It's the highest that it's been since, the 1970s, right? On top of that, we have consumer disruptions that are continuing to happen, right? We've had, we were just talking beforehand about the Suez Canal, the freezes that are happening in Texas, the massive amount of supply chain disruptions that are happening. And there's actually been a fair amount of math, even predating COVID, that these disruptions can have a pretty significant impact on your overall EBITDA for your organization. On top of that, we've got changing consumer preferences. So, we talk a lot about, I lead industrials, which are B2B or B2B2C organizations. Even in those types of organizations, consumer preferences are changing very rapidly to how can we move things faster? How can we move things quicker? How can we get closer to our end item consumer and then have more customization that comes into play, right? Which then changes how you think about your supply chain and what does that mean for your disruption? And do you want to be a global supply chain or do you need to be closer to your end item customer? We've got, component sources shifting and changing regulations that are coming into play. Right now, 75% of the world's semiconductor supply comes from East Asia. And not just East Asia, but Taiwan in and of itself, right? And that actually poses a pretty big challenge on a number of different dimensions. And then lastly, again, on the more consumer side, we've actually got a very strong consumer balance sheet. People have cash. And what this actually means is shifts in their demand structure on an even volume-based scale. So, a classic example, I have one client that was expecting their demand to be down about 65% in 2020 and ended up surging over 40% as the cash flows hit the market, as people were shifting what they were looking for in their own households in and of itself. But on the flip side of that, we also have challenges that are driving within the supply chain itself. I'm sure most of you have seen freight costs up 5% or more than 5 times. You've got trucking costs up 65%, and that's when you can get a truck, which is another big problem I'm sure most of you are facing. Labor imbalances, the labor workforce participation rate is the lowest that it's been also since the 1970s. 1970s seems to be a pretty accurate comparison we have in a lot of ways. And lastly, we have things around geopolitical tensions. Even before COVID, right, there was a lot of focus on changing geopolitical dynamics. You have the 301 tariffs that were introduced by the Trump administration, a lot of focus on China and Taiwan. However, it's actually grown, right? We now have Russia and Ukraine and all of the challenges that are coming into play. That's bringing it a lot closer to our doorstep. We're seeing what that can actually look like, whether it's in grain shortages. 80% of the world's grain supply comes from Ukraine. Whether it's, again, further exacerbating the semiconductor challenges. We've got, all the highly purified neon that's coming through Odessa that then feeds into the production of semiconductors. So a lot of changes happening. And so when we ask organizations, what are they doing about that? We actually get a number of different responses in terms of how they think about building resiliency. And so just to lay out a little bit of context for you guys on this, we do a survey at McKinsey annually. We've actually started it before COVID because resiliency, we were beginning to hear more and more buzz on the ground about what resiliency could look like. And so I have the data here that says in 2020, but it was actually released in March of 2020. So if you think about that, that was really before COVID started exploding. And what was interesting there is when we asked organizations how they were thinking about resilience in light of a number of different trends, smaller at that time, but still in place, most executives are actually already beginning to think about resilience levers, whether it's inventory or dual sourcing. You think about them as sort of the shorter term levers. Only about a quarter of them are thinking about movements in their supply chain. Now, this isn't surprising. Moving a supply chain is big, it's capital intensive, right? It's quite a bit of work. But you fast forward to 2021, where we've really had one of our first major disruptions in supply chain in the last few years, or actually I should say the last few decades. But when you look at those shifts, right, we've got now 80% of executives have implemented some sort of resilience measure. Now, they're hunkered down, they're in the trenches of COVID. Most of that is around inventory, dual sourcing, using digital to try and get transparency into their supply chain, so they're dual sourcing throughout the multiple tiers within their supply chain. But what's interesting is we now have 44% of executives thinking about regionalization, which is not quite double, but pretty darn close in a span of 1 year. Okay. Play it forward to today. We're coming, light at the end of the tunnel in terms of COVID. People are still thinking about short-term levers. Those are probably never going to go away at this point in time. Again, particularly as you start getting into the multiple layers of your supply chain. But in our most recent survey, we now have 51% of executives thinking about regionalization. So more than half of executives are now rethinking where they want to be in the globe. So with that context, we're going to dive into some of the specifics, and then we'll come back and leave you guys with some thoughts about what that might mean for you and your organizations. So I'll hand it back to Kristen.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's now my pleasure to introduce Brooke Story, President of BT Integrated Diagnostic Solutions. Brooke joined BD, one of the largest global medical technology companies in the world, in 2021 as Worldwide President, Integrated Diagnostic Solutions, and is responsible for driving global strategic, operational, commercial performance, and customer experience across the BD IDS portfolio. The IDS business includes specimen management, which comprises devices for collecting, transporting, and preparing samples for diagnostics, microbiology with clinical and industrial robotics-enabled solutions, and molecular diagnostics with informatics-supported instruments for hospital and high-throughput labs and tests for a variety of infectious diseases. Prior to joining BD, Brooke served as President, Pelvic Health and Gastric Therapies at Medtronic. She held a variety of leadership roles at Medtronic over her 15-year tenure with the company. Please join me in welcoming Brooke Story.
Thank you, Kristen. As she mentioned, I am new to Baltimore, new to this area, and part of BD. And before I jump into telling you about BD, which is an awesome company, I want to ask you guys, or take you back to February of 2020, because it informs how I got to where I am today. In February of 2020, you all might remember this, but we were just starting to see COVID here in the United States, right? There was some COVID at a senior living center out in Washington State. Next, what we found out is that it was starting to spread. We started seeing it in New York. So I want somebody from the audience to tell me, if you suspected you had COVID, what requirement did you need to pass in order to get a test in February of 2020? Correct. You need to have traveled to China. So what does that tell you? There was no supply in the channel anywhere in the world. There were lab-created tests. And what that meant for BD and the team that's based right here in Baltimore, the diagnostics business, is that they got together and they said, there's 3 things we want to do. Number 1, we want to get a test to the market as fast as we can for Europe, and we're going to partner with the European team over there, a separate company, to help us get this test to the market. Number 2, we're going to partner with somebody in the United States. BioGX was the name of the company, that we're going to partner with in the United States to get tests to this market. And number 3, we're going to develop our own tests, because we're BD and we do great things from a diagnostics perspective. That's what we do. And so what happened was, in an incredibly fast time period from Certest, which the first discussion with them was in mid-February, and the first test to the European market arrived on March 10th, we got an approval to bring that diagnostic to the market in Europe, because as you recall, Spain was getting hit really hard. Southern Europe went through a very big, tough time. Next, we started talking to our friends here in the United States, BioGX, in March of 2020. And by March 10th, there was a submission to the FDA for the emergency use authorization to bring that test to the market here. These are PCR molecular tests for labs at Johns Hopkins or University of Maryland Health System that have our BD Max in their lab. And so by, let's see, 3/5, 3/16, April 3rd was when we had tests available here in the United States. So you remember I was talking about February, and this is just April 3rd. And if any of you know how long it takes to bring a medical device or technology to the market, you know what that means. And so this is fantastic. The capacity that we had to build up to meet that requirement. We do manufacturing for these molecular tests in Quebec. So while all of this work was being done, manufacturing was being built up in Quebec. And we went from 0 tests to 1 million tests per month within 3 months. And then we're at 2 million, 3 million, I have my notes here to cheat. We went to 3 million tests per month by November of 2020. That's remarkable. That was driven by globalization because our partners were all over the world. And that leads me into BD. Who are we? It's why I came. I was incredibly impressed that BD showed that type of agility being a 125-year-old company. No offense to anybody from 100-plus-year-old companies. They don't always come off as agile. I'm just going to make that statement. We can debate it later. But BD is a dynamic med tech company. We make 45 billion devices a year. We serve the entire globe. So for us, globalization isn't going away. Our mission is advancing the world of health. And what I say and what I've seen and what we do is we're advancing the world of health for everyone, not just wealthy people in wealthy nations. We're trying to advance the world of health for everyone. So this drives our commitment to globalization. We spend a lot on R&D. We have 75,000 associates worldwide, 2,200 right here in Maryland. We're the largest med tech employer in this state. So we're really proud of that. And we have a long legacy here. This is how the businesses are split up. The diagnostics business is part of BD Life Sciences. You can see about 50% of our business is in the United States, and the rest is basically rest of world. But again, we're trying to advance this mission of advancing the world of health. So that means we've got to continue to focus on bringing these diagnostics and these therapies to everybody around the world. It's important to us. Okay, so transitioning from kind of BD and why I came, let's talk about, we got all of these tests to the market. That was fantastic, right? Everybody was better. You could go to the hospital. You didn't have to prove, as our friend said, that you went to China to get a test once you got into mid-2020, late 2020. Then what? Then all the supply chain issues that Liz mentioned started popping up. And this is as I was joining. And so every single one of these issues, for all of the global multinationals, all of these issues can impact something in supply chain. And in my 30 years in business and leading businesses, I've never spent more time on operational logistics, supply chain issues in my entire career, nor has my leadership team, right? I think that's everybody. And does it mean we want to be regional or we think we could do it all in one place? No, it means this is the reality that we have to deal with. Suez Canal, literally, I guess we had stuff on boats over there. It caused a problem. Texas freeze, it impacted plastic production. There's a paper mill strike in Finland. It literally supplies like 20% of the world's pulp. So you couldn't get labels. And if you don't have a label, you can't send a blood collection tube to a hospital because that's not on label. You can't do that. Russia, Ukraine, the diagnostics business had the largest revenue base in Russia, Ukraine of any other business within BD's organization. We have a lot of associates there, and obviously we also want to look out for their safety. China COVID lockdowns. We have suppliers that supply for our vacutainer tubes coming out of China. Every time they went on lockdown, we went on back order. It literally was an unbelievable gymnastics exercise for the whole leadership team to deal with that. And then U.S. port congestion. It goes to the comments around labor, finding truck drivers across Europe and the United States, everywhere. And so what we found over the last year and a half of having to deal with this is, number one, there's two things we're trying to deal with. Number one is fulfilling our mission and meeting the demand of our customers, right? When you have these supply chain issues, you have to figure out how to work around them and meet them. But we're a publicly traded large company, so we also have to meet the requirements of our shareholders, which means we can't let our margins go to zero because we're doing extraordinary things. And this is where we started building up the resiliency that you heard about. We started qualifying additional suppliers for our products. We did, in some cases, have to deal with paying higher prices to get an alternate for the Finland paper strike people. And we did that, but at the same time, that also meant we had to have some harder conversations and actually raise price, which is not something we've done on some of our product lines in order to manage not being non-profitable, but also making sure we could bring these really critical supplies to the market. And so we took our time doing that, and it has been another confirmation for us that globalization is important, but it's going to be more complicated going forward than it has been. So fascinating, fascinating time for us. Okay. Now, we are talking about the supply chain, we're talking about logistics. What else has complicated our business from a globalization perspective? We're also now required, as all big companies are, to think about ESG. And I'm sure all of you that are in big corporations are dealing with this. And when we think about it, I'm going to talk about kind of two components of it today. One is community health, and the second is around community health. What's the other one? The environment, of course. And what are we doing there? So we at BD are focused on this as well, and we're thinking about, we have a strategy. This is kind of pieces of it. It's a 2030 strategy, but it also adds additional complications as we think about globalization, right? There's parts of the world where this isn't a nice to do. This is going to become a must do for us to continue to bring our products into those markets. So we are focused on driving down our greenhouse gas emissions, looking at our packaging, investing in on-site renewable energy at our plants around the world, and we're committed to supporting that work. And again, we also know it means that's how we have the right to play in some markets. The other thing I'll talk about is healthy workforce and communities. And I've got an example right here, I'll tell you about it. Here in Baltimore, BD donated through our point of care business diagnostics to Esperanza Health Center. And this was in partnership with Heart to Heart and NAFC, National Association of Free Clinics. And the reason we did that, Esperanza serves a predominantly immigrant population, literally on the east side of Baltimore, maybe a block up from Johns Hopkins. And what they were finding out is that there were occasions where people showing up to be served and cared for there for dental care, health care, weren't getting their diagnostic test done because they were referred down to Johns Hopkins. And being new to Baltimore in the last year and a half, I go to Johns Hopkins, and I've been there, and I speak English well. So finding your way around if you don't speak English and you only have a limited amount of time can be a challenge. And so we partnered with Johns Hopkins as well because they wanted to know how do we kind of get these folks to get the diagnostics that they need. When you go to the doctor annually, you're getting your blood draws. And we said, we'll just bring the diagnostic into the center directly. And that's just an example of our say-do connection to ESG, that we'll donate that equipment that allows patients when they show up to actually get their test done. They don't have to go anywhere. They can get the test done. It takes 15 minutes. Point of care is meeting patients where they are. And as we think about globalization, in diagnostics, what's interesting is it's shifting. Right? Traditionally, everything was done in a big lab or at the hospital, and now you're seeing diagnostics being done at retail clinics. And we saw with COVID, with the at-home test, that now we can trust you to take a test on your own and get the right result. So it's a fantastic transition, and the bottom line is it's going to keep happening. This commitment to ESG, the globalization of the economy and our ability to adjust and be agile will make a huge difference. So finally, I'll just wrap with this. And Clayton Millis, who's on WTCI's board, gave me this quote, but it's a great quote and it's one I love. And we were talking about how this global pandemic has shifted diagnostics from the basement to the boardroom. It's a conversation that everyone's having now, because in the case that the globe continues to face pandemics, infectious disease pandemics, there's going to be a need for us to continue to be agile, to continue to serve the globe, and to continue to leverage the global economy to do that. And so for that, we think we're set up for doing it, and we're really excited about it. So completely aligned with the globalization comments that Kristen made. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Brooke. That is a very powerful quote to end on. I'm now very pleased to introduce Drew Greenblatt. We're going from a large multinational firm to a smaller business that is a US-based manufacturing firm. Drew Greenblatt is the president and owner of Marlin Steel Wire Products. Drew bought Marlin Steel in 1998 when it was a small maker of a commodity product. Since then, he's grown revenue 21-fold, and in February 2021, expanded its factory floor space by 56%. February 2021, so mid-COVID. Despite COVID headwinds, Marlin grew over 25% in 2020 and an additional 28% in 2021. Actually, 4 years in a row of double-digit sales growth. In the face of challenges in the global economy, Marlin Steel has invested over $6.3 million in robotics in a quest for quality and speed, and has recently purchased Baltimore Automatic Wire Forming Corporation, retaining 100% of its staff. In December 2021, Marlin purchased Madsen Wire and retained all of its employees, and has also increased the staff 50% and wages and benefits in less than 5 months, and invested over $1.5 million in new equipment. Marlin Steel imports nothing and exports material handling baskets, wire forms, and sheet metal fabrications to 43 countries. Marlin's all USA-made products include daily shipments to Mexico and Canada, as well as weekly shipments to India and China. I'm very pleased to introduce Drew Greenblatt.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, WTCI and Kristen, for that wonderful introduction. We're thrilled to be here. Hugely important topic, globalization, what's its future? I'm very passionate about American manufacturing. I'm very optimistic about American manufacturing. I think this is a wonderful time, and Marlin and American manufacturing is positioned, I believe, for huge upside, huge future moving forward. I think globalization is important. However, I think the pendulum swung a little too far. We put too many eggs in one basket, and I think the pendulum is swinging back. It's not going to go all the way back to only buying from domestic suppliers, but it's going to be a more well thought out, conservative approach to have local suppliers performing so you could ship on time, high quality parts. We're seeing it at Marlin. It's powering our growth. We're betting with our own money. We're investing in local factories. We're investing in factories in the Midwest. We're looking to buy more factories because we're so enthusiastic about how the pendulum is coming back and American growth is going to happen. We're hiring more talent because we have more demand. More people are saying, you know what? I got to be more safe. I got to have my production local. Marlin's not the only one. Throughout America, we're seeing many factories getting purchase orders. And when they get a purchase order, they have to hire more people. At Marlin, the ratio is about $250,000. Every time we get a $250,000 order, we have to hire about another person. Well, in America in general, we have had 350,000 new manufacturing jobs created. It's phenomenal. And it's not just 1 year. It's not just a 1 year blip. This is a trend line that's been going on year in, year out, as we were told before, where people are rethinking the supply chain. They're saying, you know what, we don't want to have everything tied into overseas. We got to protect ourselves and have things, some things made stateside in America. So year in, year out, there's been positive employment growth because more orders are being given to local factories, American factories. Again, I want to stress, globalization has positives. You could buy more inexpensive goods from overseas. It's cheaper to buy some things overseas. And it's also easier there's a significant infrastructure overseas to ramp up quickly for huge volume, when it's a very large volume project. But people are, again, starting to rethink globalization, and there's several reasons why. Some have already been discussed. In the COVID-19, it became very clear what some of the challenges are. For example, all of a sudden, prices spiked. All of a sudden, you couldn't get stuff because it was late. Whether it was the port, you can't get a truck driver, you can't even get a container to load the truck. It was just all kinds of challenges. Another problem was people over the years have reconsidered buying overseas because of IP theft, intellectual property theft, because you don't want your intellectual property stolen. There are so many smart people at BD that are coming up with phenomenally good ideas, doctors and researchers that are coming up with innovations and patents. They want that protected. Marlin also is leaning into intellectual property. We have many patents, and we also have 20% of our team are chemical engineers or degreed engineers coming up with slick innovations so that we can be innovative and different. The last thing American companies want is for this IP to be stolen. And in our country, in America, we're very protective of intellectual property. In Europe, they're very protective. Canada, they're very protective. However, in some countries, they don't value intellectual property. And I think that's contributing to the rethinking of where do you build things and where do you invest in new innovations. But the impacts are massive. For example, shipping container freights went up, zoomed up, and that made a lot of people rethink whether or not you're going to bring stuff in from overseas. Now, these rates recently have come down a little bit, okay, which is a good thing. But what's happened is that if all of a sudden in the past it was $4,000 or $2,500 to move a container from Shanghai to Chicago, and now it's $29,000, or it was a couple months ago, you're going to rethink, particularly if it's a big volume product. Also, there was several times, for example, overseas, in China, for example, where they had shutdowns. This is a chart of factory shutdowns, and you could see the spikes of the factories getting shut down that you alluded to. One time it was because of the COVID lockdowns, and the other time it was because of energy. They had run out of, there was so much energy the droughts caused energy problems. So if you're trying to buy from overseas, you need a very dependable and stable source. This is some of the reasons why people are reconsidering having all their eggs overseas. And I'm amazed it's only 50% of the CEOs have thought of this. It's amazing to me that it's not 100% when you have these kinds of challenges. We talked about the intellectual property. People are challenged by the CCP allowing intellectual property to be rampantly stolen and then used against us. This is unacceptable. And that's all the more reason why people are leaning more and more into America, Canada, and European production. But again, there's a huge draw to build in China and build overseas. And a big reason, of course, is how cheap it is. In China, for example, in my industry, steel is subsidized. In my industry, the labor is subsidized. In my industry, overseas, they subsidize exports. So all of these are tremendous hindrances to the American, when you make a comparison between American and Chinese pricing. We also have very good rules for protecting the environment, which I'm thrilled with. We have very good rules to protect our labor, our talent. They have that's less of an importance to them. And because of that, their costs are less, and because of that, they can charge a cheaper price. And we haven't even talked about using prison labor, child labor, and of course, having concentration camps where they make things for much cheaper than we can make them in America. But there's a lot of challenges going on besides China, overseas. We have issues with, of course, Russia, as we've discussed earlier today. God, they attacked a country that was a democracy standing alone and upset the whole, killed all kinds of Ukrainians, and this terrible war is raging on. It's unsettling to the European, the whole European continent. It's unbelievable we're having another war in Europe. Now, of course, Russia's retaliating because we're supporting them. They turn off Nord Stream, and it's driving up energy costs. In Germany the other day, I saw energy costs are going to be 10 times higher for factories. It's challenging. Those costs are really crippling German factories. This is a chart about France, and you can see what the price has happened in France. This is going to hurt our trading partners overseas in Germany. Again, part of the reason why I think the pendulum has gone too far and why it's going to come back more stateside. Of course, another reason is diplomatic, political uncertainty. They have taken over Hong Kong in 2019. As we know, they crushed a revolt, the student revolt in 1989. The concern is Taiwan next? That would be a terrible catastrophe. 20-some million people that live in a democracy. And strategically incredibly important, as was mentioned, 75–80% of all chips made that are used in our iPhones. I mean, who wants to pay $5,000 for an iPhone? You know, all the iPhones, all of the cars, so many pieces of equipment are tied to these chips that are in this little country, peaceful country, minding its own business, that's in the crosshairs right now. It's very upsetting, and this will impact the supply chain if, God forbid, they attack them. We don't want that to happen. And before I wrote this, I didn't even put down North Korea. I mean, you know, this week with them shooting all kinds of missiles, I mean, that's how I couldn't keep you know, Kristen was like, enough, you know. So, I mean, but now I could have slides of North Korea too. I mean, poor Korea could be hurt. So it's so upsetting. Bottom line is we're so blessed that we have such wonderful neighbors like Canada, like Mexico, right, where we live in a peaceful hemisphere. And American companies are reconsidering, hey, you know, we shouldn't have all our eggs in crazy environments. A very good tool that people should consider is a tool called the Tco Estimator, when you want to do the math to see if it makes sense to move from overseas back to America. And the Reshoring Institute has put this together, and it's a little Excel spreadsheet. A lot of times people say, well, here's the quote from the American vendor, and here's the quote from the Chinese vendor, right? Ah, look, the Chinese vendor's cheaper. I'm going to buy from the Chinese vendor. That's the conventional way of doing it. The Tco Estimator is a wonderful tool because it shows, yeah, those are two important inputs, but there's other inputs. There's the duties costs. There's the freight cost. There's the time on the water. There's the insurance costs, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes through an exhaustive list that includes all the different costs. And then when you do the math, it turns out about 30% of American imports shouldn't be done. They should be made in America because it's actually cheaper to do it in America if you use the estimator. And by the way, this doesn't include environmental impacts, which is a massive, and they're doing an update on the Tco Estimator to enhance it to include environmental. If you add environmental, I don't know whether it's going to get to 50% or 60%, but it's going in a different direction than the conventional purchasing manager uses in America nowadays. So the bottom line is, it's time to prepare. It's time to prepare for localization. We have to get into the mindset where we have to reconsider and recalibrate. I'm not saying bring everything back from overseas. I'm saying everything has to be reconsidered and rethought through and looked at with a fresh pair of eyes. Bottom line is policymakers in America have to reconsider how we're doing things. Because if all this surge of American manufacturing occurs to keep up with all this new demand as people recalibrate, reconsider everything, what's going to be the end result? Well, the end result's going to be we're going to have a lot more factory workers needed. Another result is that we're going to have a situation where we're going to have to change how we think about things. But it's important to understand a big reason why we should move forward with more reshoring, again, is sustainability, because it's going to be less impact on our environment. And again, American factories in general, North American factories in general, are very good with on-time delivery, and they provide less drama. It enables us to be more nimble, as was mentioned. And if we're more nimble, we can run smaller batch sizes. You don't have to have big, huge warehouses overseas, big warehouses here as buffer. And you can pivot quickly. If the client likes green, you have a small batch size, you can make it in green. Next week they want it in orange, well, you can easily pivot to orange. It's easier to do if you have a localized team. A big impact recently is the CHIPS Act. That is going to drive a lot of innovation in America and a lot of manufacturing in America. They announced an enormous plant in New York State, upstate New York, near Syracuse to make Micron. Is going to be making a very large plant out there. Ohio is getting 2 big plants with Intel. This is going to help mitigate all of our eggs in the Taiwan basket, and we're going to have hopefully on our way to 50% or more of chips made in America. I think this will be a positive long-term output for us, effect for us. But our nation has to reconsider some things, because if we're going to be making a lot more things here, we have to reconsider the American workforce. We have to lead in, because this is going to be a party here for the American workers. And we're going to offer a lot more jobs. We're going to have to hire a lot more people, but we need the talent to keep up with this. And we're going to have to treat them really well. You know, they didn't treat Tom Brady very well up in Boston, and they lost him. That was a mistake. We have to treat our factory workers really well so we could retain them and keep them so they don't go elsewhere. We're going to have to invest in a lot of robots so we could be more automated, so we can make high quality. We actually set records for the most robots put into place. We have 3 very large robots coming into our Indiana plant and 2 into our Baltimore plant. It's going to have a big impact. They're coming later this year. We're leaning into having more robots. And an important factor is, like the Indiana plant, which is getting $1 million robot, we're going to have to hire 10 people to keep up with that robot. A lot of people think, well, if you buy a robot, you don't need as many people. It's actually the opposite, because what happens is it's going to create so much work. We're going to have this wonderful group of people that are going to have to keep up with this new machine. And if you have this machine, you have to run it, and that's going to happen if you have the talent. So it's going to create a lot of new jobs, a lot of opportunities. And bottom line is the cost of not automating is going to kill you because it's very expensive to not automate. And in the future, moving forward, people are going to have to lean into that as our nation. Thank you so much. Bottom line is very optimistic about American manufacturing, very optimistic about reshoring and localization. It's going to improve the environment, help the American factory worker. It's going to bring people out of poverty and into the middle class. Thank you so much.
Liz, if you would join us again to close us out with some insights, and thank you so much, Drew.
Do we have the last 2 pages?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Perfect. All right. Sorry, we have to double
There
click
we go.
that. So just to close us out a little bit as we think about globalization. So we started with the statistic that 51% of executives these days are thinking about regionalizing or shifting their network structures. And Drew, you asked the question, well, why isn't it 100%? So to take a little bit of data around what's actually happening and how our organization's actually moving and shifting. Apologize, I am missing a little bit of my title, but the left-hand side, you're actually looking at the growth rate of North American imports over the last decade. Okay, so the truth is, over the last decade, North American imports have grown about 35%, meaning we are less self-sufficient and more reliant on a global supply chain and global network. Now, where are they coming from? We've talked a lot about China. We've mentioned Ukraine, Russia, other countries within the world. But where the growth is actually coming from is actually Southeast Asia. So that's, SEA is not Seattle in this case. It's actually Southeast Asia. So Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. If any of you guys have been in Hanoi, you notice when you walk in, you see they're just constantly dredging the port there, making more capacity, more room, et cetera. India is actually second on the list. We've got a number of government initiatives around Made in India that are in play. You look at things like castings, et cetera. Big shift to India. Mexico, you mentioned our other partners here in North America. Mexico is actually seeing a pretty significant increase as well in terms of what they're bringing into the U.S. And then we've got, obviously Europe and China and Canada still remaining partners. So what is driving this shift? It's not actually regionalization or deglobalization, but it's a fundamental shift in supply chains and where and how we're thinking about sourcing. So as Drew put it, not to put all of our eggs in a single basket. And the truth is, what is happening is different depending upon different industries and different organizations and what's going to matter most fundamentally to you and yours. So we mentioned cost, and a cost being a large driver for organizations originally moving to China. Well, in the past 10 years, labor rates have actually increased between 40 and 60% in China. So what used to be a very, very low cost country is now actually a middle cost country for most organizations. In fact, I think they're actually on the verge of becoming an upper middle income economy by the official definitions of that. So you look at their wage rates and you look at Mexico, they're actually roughly on par, right? Now you still look at Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, our Southeast Asian partners, and you still see a lower labor rate. So when you're thinking about a highly labor-intensive industry, apparel, textiles, things where there's a lot of people with actual hands-on material, you're actually looking more at some of these other regions instead of a pure regionalization play. We mentioned environment actually a couple times. One of the areas driving actual regionalization, you can actually have up to 10 times reduced emissions by regionalizing your supply chain. I'm working with one company, they make wooden toys. The wood is sourced in Brazil. It's shipped to China. Interestingly enough, like 80% of the world's toys are made in a single city in China. So you get your wood in Brazil, you ship it to China, make it into a puzzle, a horse, whatever, and then you ship it back to the US. That is a lot of diesel fuel going to just moving things around. And last I looked, we had wood in this hemisphere and could actually put it into a toy. Geopolitics and risk. So we've talked a lot about the disruptions. One of the things that has historically challenged organizations is being able to put a dollar figure on what does that mean. It's avoidance of cost, which we typically don't give credit for in a lot of organizations. When you actually sit back and do the math, and this figure is actually a pre-COVID figure, interestingly enough, so I would love to refresh it someday, but pre-COVID, the average organization, global organization, lost about 6 months of EBITDA every decade because of risk and supply disruptions. So that was before Texas freeze, Suez Canal, Finland paper mill strikes, and all those other bubbles that came into play, right? So just imagine what it's like now as we continue to face these going forward. Talent shortages. Brooke put it quite nicely. This is not a US phenomenon. Many of the major manufacturing centers in China are facing pretty severe labor shortages. They're happening in the US, they're happening in Mexico. We've done a survey of executives who are moving production to Mexico. The number one reason cited for why they're not achieving their business case is they're not able to fulfill the labor demands in the location, particularly in some of the big maquiladora towns that are pretty well known. So, you start to think about automation, all the things that need to complement and come as you're working through these supply chain shifts. And then the last thing, I'm not going to belabor it further, you see different levels of service, different need for customization, particularly looking for your 2-day delivery, but you want to have your name embroidered on it. That's a very different supply chain than something that has to sit 4 to 6 weeks on the water coming from someplace in Asia. So all of these factors, and the reason why we list them and belabor them out, and there are obviously many others, means different industries are going to come to a different supply chain. Globalization is not dead. It's not. But if you're an apparel company and you have high labor intensity, or a company that has a number of semiconductors and electronics versus a company that's making airplanes that's already got a lot of their supply chain regionalized or localized, it's going to look very, very different for each of you. And so with that, I'm going to skip ahead and leave you guys with a few last thoughts to think about. We have our lovely little framework on the left, which gives you, kind of the different dimensions folks are considering within their supply chain. But across each of these dimensions, there's a couple of questions that we kind of want to leave in your mind. The first one, what regionalization trends will matter most to you? As I mentioned, looks very, very different depending upon your company, your industry, your organization. But if you do nothing, what happens to your performance? So this toy company that I'm talking to, every day their competitors are announcing new facilities, new factories, new plants coming into North America. And they're sitting here going, okay, it's a lot of investment It's a multi-year journey. Am I going to be left behind if I wait 6 months to make my decision? How much can you improve your current supply chain performance by shifting production? Drew, you had some wonderful stats and conversations about what you've been able to do with your customers and the organizations that you work with. What can it mean to you, whether it's cost reduction, emissions improvement, or frankly, growth in sales? That's actually a big one that we're starting to see and starting to ask whether you're a supplier benefiting from it or whether you're somebody who's going directly to market. And again, by getting closer to your customer, what can that mean for you? And then lastly, just, regionalization is not a small move, right? So as you're thinking about what are the right big moves for you over the next few months and then even into the long term, where do you want to invest? Where do you want to put your resources behind? So just the last few thoughts to leave you with, and I'll hand it over to Kristen.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We do have about 15 minutes for Q&A. If anyone in the audience has a question, thank you, Liz, for leaving us with some questions to think about. We'd be happy to open it up.
On the issue of talent, what do you think we could be doing as a city-state to increase the talent pipeline for manufacturing? Go first.
Yeah, I think the city, so sure, we actually manufacture a lot of products right here in Baltimore. If you've ever driven up Interstate 83 to York, Pennsylvania, on the right side, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, on the right side, our plant is right there. And we hire, those 2,200, a lot are factory workers. I think for the city and state, we need to continue to educate our youth as they're coming up and make sure we've got a youth to work pipeline. We actually partner with the University of Maryland, Baltimore to support STEM education programs here in the city. I think that's really important because if we don't fundamentally train and educate the population around here, the young people that are in the schools, particularly in Baltimore City, we're going to have a gap, and there's no reason for that. Genius isn't limited to wealthy neighborhoods. And we're better than that, I think, as a country and as a state and as a city. So I think that's incredibly important. I think we all have to lean in and help and support that. And then for us, the other thing we're thinking about is really trying to make it easy for people to work with us and get out to Sparks. We're up in Sparks and in Hunt Valley near the light rail. But there's all kinds of things we've done to deal with shift changes. And I know everybody's thinking about that, but like we'd gone to, I guess, a 12-hour shift, and then we lost like a ton of people. They just didn't want to do it. Mandatory overtime, all that kind of stuff. So we're also being flexible on that. And I think all of us have had to be flexible more recently from a labor perspective.
Great points. We only hire locals in Baltimore City. So this is very near and dear to our heart. Manufacturing is an amazing job. It's a great job to pull people from poverty and bring them into the middle class. The average wage is over $85,000 a year, average. And you don't have to be a doctorate from Hopkins to get $85 large a year. It's an extraordinarily good pay. Oh, and we give health insurance and vacation. We have the worst PR agent in the world, because we have these amazing jobs and we cannot get talent to realize that our opportunities are so much better than being a barista or work in retail, right? Where you're not paid health insurance, where you're not given vacation, you're not giving sick days, right? And you get low pay. Oh, or you can work a really great middle-class job, send your kid to University of Maryland, go to Ocean City for the weekends because you can afford it, right? So we're doing a really bad job. We need to get the guidance counselors to recognize that we're a great avenue. Now, I'm not saying don't go to Hopkins. I love Hopkins. I'm not saying don't go to University of Maryland. University of Maryland's amazing. What I'm saying is there's a certain group of students where the right thing to do is to go into vocational, consider a vocational tech job, okay? Because we offer a great path. Hopkins and University of Maryland are not for everybody. So my recommendation is we have to get guidance counselors and we have to get teachers, principals into BD, show them how great we are. Then we have to bring students in, give them tours, show them what we offer. Same thing with Marlin, same with other factories. And I think that's how we can change the conversation. Your organization is really connecting dots for people, and I can't thank you enough, Ed, for what you guys do in teaching people that, STEM is really cool and robotics are really neat. Oh, and by the way, you can get a job at Marlin for 50, 80 more grand a year just to start out to learn and set up these robots. We have to connect the dots for people.
Could I?
Please.
I used to work at Bechtel. I worked on the Bactec systems early in my career, which if you're not familiar with, at that time, if you had a blood test taken for a bacterial infection, there was 80% chance it was going in a Bactec machine.
It's still more than 50.
And I work in STEM education through competitive robotics in the area. And I think if I did a poll of the kids that play that sport and asked them what BD was, they were, and especially for young women, BD, if you don't know, is especially like when I do tours, the young women are just blown away by the environment. I've been to Marlin Steel, and my own kid wanted to work there because it was like cutting steel with lasers and stuff. But I agree, it's a PR problem. It's a marketing and communications. They're great jobs, and in Baltimore City, many times the parents are like, "Don't go into that. You'll lose a hand." And I'm like, dude, this is not 1890. Anyway.
It's safe, it's clean, great jobs.
So Ed, I actually work with a number of different cities as they're trying to think about how to prepare for regionalization in a lot of ways. And there is certainly this aspect of PR. A lot of them are actually offering just straight up paying for vocational training in a number of ways. They are complementing it with targeted programs in their universities around robotics because you typically, one of the real advantages of a lot of cities in Baltimore where you've got, University of Maryland's not that far away, is you can support a STEM base of engineers that are then needed to help, design and deploy the robots in a different ways. I would also encourage, as you guys think about this, going even a little bit further to look at how you can attract some of those folks that are going to be working in that base into your city. So one of the city councils I work with, it's weird to think about, but they have directors of entertainment and lifestyle whose entire focus is on how they can attract manufacturing type profiles from a little bit further out to come closer into those things. So all he does is it's like a cruise ship director programming, right, is what he's doing. But the idea is to actually move people closer to the facilities where they are trained and where they do have the capability to do that. You can actually see there's actually pretty large commute patterns for a lot of people that are in these types of industries. And so if you can help change and shift that, things like investing in your public transportation infrastructure. I don't know if I'm echoing here. Yeah, I'm wondering if this accidentally got switched on. Okay, I think I'm dual mic'd on accident. I must have switched myself on in my pocket. But anyways, thinking about your public infrastructure and how you can move people better, more readily around you. Look at facilities in Mexico or the other ones. They're actually bussed into their facilities to help manage the shift patterns and work. So training is a big part of it, but in reality, you're going to look at a more holistic methodology to try and ensure that you can grow a robust talent base, attract a robust talent base, and then attract the organizations that are going to come and employ the folks to deploy there. So.
Thank you. What's going on with Mike? Sorry about the mic. Hi. In the blue. Yep.
Tom Brignacci with JPMorgan Chase. First, thank you to the panel for your insightful discussion. I have a question for Drew, who commented in your slides regarding industrial policy. So I really appreciate the term because I noticed now in 2022 it's becoming more talked about. And if you look at our major competitors, which you discussed, particularly China, Japan, South Korea, they've had an industrial policy going on 100 years, and it's part and parcel of their economy and culture and society and their politics. We haven't had that here for lots of reasons, but it seems like this year, perhaps it will take hold for all the reasons that we're talking about with supply chain disruptions and price shocks and geopolitical matters. So really my question for the panel is, do you think that now finally some type of industrial policy will take hold in this country that has staying power and we can really start tackling the issues of reshoring and building the middle class back up with manufacturing, as Drew put, it sounds to me would be really important.
So in general, industrial policy is not my cup of tea. In general, I believe in free market capitalism. Period. That being said, we're in a situation where, like you just described, other countries are doing it. So we can't be the only one that is being pure Adam Smith when everybody else is doing this industrial policy. That's number one. Number two, computer chips are way too important. You can't have 75, 80% of all computer chips made in Taiwan. And the CCP has run through Hong Kong recently, and they're saying explicitly they're going to run over Taiwan. So we can't have 80% of our chips made in controlled by the CCP. It's not a wise thing. Computer chips are too important. There might be a couple other industries we have to have a similar kind of thesis. That's my take. So I think the industrial policy on chips is the right thing to do because it's so critical. Maybe there's a couple other industries we should consider of similar mindset. And we have to protect and coddle and nurture those industries so we can have them domestically made.
So we actually have had industrial policy, not just in the last year, but it's been around for some time. And we've started seeing actually pretty big changes in it with the start of the 301 tariffs that came from the Trump organization. And then even Biden's 100-day report, one of the first things in there is actually a list of 7 industries. So Drew, to your point, it's not just semiconductors, but things like advanced pharmaceuticals and such that were identified as actually defense industrial risk to the country, like areas where we are systematically vulnerable to attack from other organizations. And so, how far and how extreme the industrial policy is going to go, we don't know. But I would say you can look at even now things like the Inflation Reduction Act and whatnot. They're not actually backing out any of those shifts in policy, like the 301 tariffs that came into play. And you can even hear rumors of additional policies coming into play, things like the Pan American Highway, where there's funding really from a defense perspective that are coming into play. So, we can't speculate, we can't look in a crystal ball, but I think if you look at the trends and the conversations that are happening in Washington, they're not going away. And they certainly seem to be here to stay for, the next 4, 5, 10 years, probably.
I'm Peter Bowie with the member of the board. A question for McKinsey and I guess TD, picking up on Drew's comments about Taiwan and Russia. I think he missed one thing, which is like 5 exclamation points after those 2 points. If you were a Russian, if you're a German chemical or heavy industry manufacturer now, you're facing an existential risk. It's not just the price of energy. You may get shut down because there is no energy. Now, we are fortunate we have more energy than Europe, but similarly, to the extent we're dependent on China, we've got Xi's going to get reelected. We have basically autocratic tyrants running 2 countries which have totally disrupted our assumptions about the world. WTO, I think it's a bipartisan consensus that failed bringing China into our system of norms and trading. So my question really is to, if you're McKinsey, how can you limit your advice to 6 months of EBITDA risk from the geopolitical risk? It seems to me like it's an existential risk for anyone who's dependent on China, whether it's not just toys, and we can live without toys, but we can't, and it's not just chips, it's all the components, whether it's castings, et cetera, that I think any big business has to be figuring out how to alternatively source as fast as possible.
So you're right. The EBITDA is an average, right? And so not every organization is going to have a fully existential risk. And in fact, I think we would argue that most aren't going to face an existential risk in the near future. And by near, it's 5 or 10 years. At the end of the day, the economies between China and the West are still highly intertwined. semiconductors, we talk a lot about Taiwan, but a lot of the lithography machines that are required to make semiconductors are made in the Netherlands. The neon's coming from Ukraine. So if you were to look at this and say, okay, and by the way, most of the IP and the design is actually still done in the US. So sure, if we play the war game out, China goes into Taiwan, takes it over, shuts off the supply. Well, guess what? They can't produce them anyways because they don't have the lithography that's coming from the Netherlands. They don't have the neon that's coming from the Ukraine, and they don't have the design and innovation yet that is coming from the US. I think also most of the silica, my semiconductor colleagues will probably have the direct facts on it, but I believe most of the silica and the substrates are actually also produced in the US, and there's a pretty heavy concentration on this. And so when you actually start to tangle, this is a little bit of what I was talking about with the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 in your supply chain. There's risk all the way through all of those tiers, but as of right now, they're still so intertangled that the risk of an immediate disruption and complete barricade is actually fairly low. It's not minimal, it's not zero, but it's fairly low. But that's why you start to see organizations that are working on systematically rethinking through those shifts and rethinking through that structuring. It's why we see, you mentioned Intel and a couple of the other facilities, but there's also TSMC and Texas Instruments and all of these other organizations that are also reinvesting, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever the word that you want to use on it. So long-winded way of saying, yes, it's existential in a way, but it's so intertangled right now that it's not hugely likely in the immediate term. So I'll go sit back down now that I'm not interfering anymore.
Okay, well, that concludes our program. Thank you to our presenters. It leaves us with a lot more to think about, a lot more to talk about. Fortunately, AGILE will continue. Our fourth session will be coming up November 15th. It'll be held at the National Aquarium in Baltimore, and this is on climate change and sustainability. This topic that we touched on today, we're just getting started with. Obviously, this major shift in globalization will continue to progress, and so I absolutely expect that WTCI will be continuing to revisit this topic. Thank you so much to our speakers and presenters. Thank you to our audience and the great questions. And I would like to invite everyone that is here in person to stay for our networking cocktail reception. And for those of us that have joined from home or from your office, I hope that you have an equally enjoyable reception awaiting you in your kitchen or in your commute home. I, by the way, made that joke up just now. Okay, thank you all so much. Have a good evening.